I'm planning some terrible mass murder. Well, in that case, there is undoubtedly a great deal of moral disagreement. Actually, there's a lot of disagreement in a lot of areas, but it seems like the moral disagreement is more persistent. It sticks around. This is the basis, this fact, the fact that there's all this moral disagreement, is the basis for at least one of the reasons that we might think that some kind of moral skepticism is true. Okay, so today we're talking about this reading, I should probably say. There is undoubtedly a lot of moral disagreement about controversial topics like abortion, or the death penalty, and about a million other things also. And it seems like these arguments, or these disagreements, or this diversity of moral opinion, it just goes on and on and on. It doesn't go away. It seems to be, in a certain way, persistent. I don't really even know if that's how you spell persistent. But moral disagreement sticks around. And it seems to stick around in the way that scientific disagreement doesn't, right? Scientists disagree just for a short amount of time. Consider, for example, disagreement about whether or not there are tectonic plates. Is that how you spell tectonic? I don't know. There's probably an H in there. Probably. Somewhere in here, maybe there's an H. Here's the thing about tectonic plates. For a very long time, geologists thought that the continents did not move. And there was sort of in the middle of the 20th century, not very long ago, in like the 60s, there started to be some folks more and more vocally who were insisting that the continents moved around, right? And that South America and Africa were once together. And there was enormous disagreement, and the scientists yelled at each other, and they had conferences, and they mocked one another, and they undermined each other's findings, and they disagreed. But that only lasted a couple decades at most. By the time we get to the 70s and 80s, all of the geologists had come to accept the growing set of evidence showing that actually the surface of the Earth consisted of these sort of, well, plates, and they moved around. And that explained why the continents were where they are, and why there were volcanic eruptions in certain places and not others. It explained all sorts of stuff. So there was scientific disagreement, but it wasn't persistent. It went away after they gathered enough evidence. But the moral disagreement doesn't seem to go away. It seems to stick around for not just 10 or 20 or 30 or 40 years, but for millennia. It sticks around seemingly forever. And so you might think, well, if this moral disagreement sticks around in a way that scientific disagreement doesn't, then maybe what that shows is that there just are no objective moral facts. There are no universal moral facts that apply to everyone everywhere. That's why we keep disagreeing, and we can't settle our disagreements. This is what MacKinnon and Fiala, in the reading for today, call the diversity of moral views argument for ethical relativism. Now, I should say a couple things about this title or this label. The first thing is this. They're talking about ethical relativism, but actually this sort of argument, it seems to apply to, well, what we're calling just general ethical or moral skepticism. That is, if this argument works, the argument that there's persistent moral disagreement, and that therefore there are no objective moral facts, that seems to just count against moral objectivism and in favor of general moral skepticism, whether it be some kind of relativism or some kind of nihilism about moral matters or whatever. What would be nice to have in order to really flesh out this argument is an example of a domain or an area of discourse where there's persistent disagreement and where the right conclusion to draw from that disagreement is that there are no objective facts about that domain. We might find this in matters of taste. We say sometimes that peanut butter is tasty, or that pickles are tasty, or that pecan pie is tasty. And there's some disagreement about these things, right? We disagree. We say, no, pickles are disgusting, they're gross, says someone. And someone else says, oh no, they taste great, they're delicious. This disagreement doesn't seem to go away. It's not like we just gather more evidence, you try one more pickle, and then the disagreement disappears. It sticks around. And so then the conclusion that we should draw from this persistent disagreement is that there are no objective facts. There are no universal, objective taste facts. Facts about what's tasty for everyone everywhere and what's not tasty for everyone everywhere. There are no such facts. And we can see that there are no such facts partly from, well, the existence of persistent disagreement about matters of taste. And so then the thought is, well, morality exhibits the same kind of persistent disagreement as matters of taste. There we go. Well, whatever. Morality exhibits the same kind of persistent disagreement as matters of taste. And so, like matters of taste, and unlike matters of science, morality doesn't consist of objective moral facts. All right, that's the argument. It's an argument for a kind of moral skepticism. And the question is whether this kind of argument works. Now, what we would want is an alternative explanation, because you see what's going on here is that we've got a seemingly unimpeachable fact, or, well, at least a rather plausible fact on the face of it. And that's the fact that moral disagreement sticks around. And it seems like, in the case of taste, it seems like the best explanation for that persistent disagreement is the non-existence of objective facts. And so the question is, are there examples of domains that, like taste, involve persistent disagreement, right? So we want a case of persistent disagreement, but where it would be misguided to conclude from the existence of this persistent disagreement that there are no objective facts of the matter. We need an example like that. Here's one. Theological matters. The existence and the nature of God. There's persistent disagreement. It's gone on for much longer than a decade or so. It's gone on for millennia. Does some kind of divine entity exist? Did this entity create the universe? Did this entity write a book? Which book? Persistent disagreement. Sticks around for a long time. But you might think it's kind of bizarre to suppose, therefore, that there's just no objective fact of the matter. It seems like, look, there's an objective fact. Either God exists or not. At least that's the case once we're clear about what we mean by God. Some people, a lot of the time, are very loose about this sort of thing, right? And they'll define God as, the feeling that they get when they understand another person's situation or something like that, or the feeling of love when they see their children and grandchildren or something like that. That's a perfectly fine thing to say in ordinary conversation, I suppose, but usually we don't take that literally. We don't take it seriously. If by the word God you mean a feeling, then you definitely don't mean God. You can think that God, as it is traditionally understood, causes a feeling, right? Makes you have a feeling, but no one really thinks that God is a feeling. When theologians and philosophers of religion talk about God, they give some at least moderately precise definition. They define God as some creature that's benevolent and omnipotent, that means all-powerful, right? And omniscient, that means all-knowing, right? And so you've got a creature with these characteristics. And then the question is, does this creature exist? Okay, so once you've defined what you're talking about, oh, we're talking about a creature that's all good and all-knowing and all-powerful. Once you've defined what you're talking about, it seems like even though there's persistent disagreement, there is an objective fact. It's just one way or another, right? Either God exists or not. And we don't know, and there's continual debate, but there's just a fact of the matter. Does this creature exist or not? It's the same thing with, like, I don't know, the platypus. Is there such a thing as a platypus? We give a definition of what a platypus would be like. It's a seafaring ocean creature, and it sort of has a bill like a duck, sort of. I don't know, you give some rough definition, and then it's just a question, is there a creature like this? And there's an objective fact. And so too with God. Is there a creature like this? And there's just an objective fact. So the existence of persistent disagreement, it seems, doesn't always suggest that there's no objective fact to the matter. Maybe morality is like that. If that was the case, then, well, there would be persistent moral disagreement, but it wouldn't show that moral skepticism is correct. So that is the first of the arguments or reasons for ethical relativism that MacKinnon and Fiala discuss. Now we're going to talk about just one more. So the next reason that MacKinnon and Fiala give for perhaps accepting ethical relativism has to do with situational differences. Here's what they say. The situations and living worlds of different people vary so much that it is difficult to believe that the same things that would be right for one would be right for another. In some places, overpopulation or drought is a problem. Other places have too few people or too much water. How do we get from this correct observation that the living situations of different people in different parts of the world are dramatically different in a variety of ways, not just in this way, they go on and list some other ways. How do we get from this fact about situational differences to some kind of objection to moral objectivism? The view that there are objective, universal moral facts or moral laws that apply to everyone everywhere, no matter what they think or no matter what their situation. How do we get from here to here? Well, it might be something like this. You try to articulate a moral law or one of these universal moral principles, something like stealing is wrong. If someone has something that's theirs, you can't just go and take it from them. If you do take it from them, you've done something wrong. Okay, that seems like a good candidate. But the thought is that, well, that really only applies in some situations, when there's perhaps too few people or too much water or plenty of water, right? If you're watching this, chances are you live in a place where there's tons of safe drinking water. It's all over the place. We pour it on plants and we give it to our animals, the same water that we would drink ourselves. We spray down our muddy boots with perfectly good drinking water. We have tons of it. If that's the case, and you can go get it all over the place, right? You don't have to own a home and pay a water bill to get drinking water. Just, I mean, frankly, if you go into the downtown area of any town in the developed world and you find a fountain and there's water spraying up out of the fountain, that's drinkable water. You could just go and drink that water. It won't get you sick or anything like that, right? If you're living in that kind of scenario, well, then walking up to someone who has some water and taking their water from them and drinking just a little bit of it, that seems like it's wrong. Because even if you are desperately thirsty and dehydrated, you could get the water that you need to sustain yourself from some other means that doesn't involve stealing. But if you're in a situation where there is severe drought and maybe overpopulation, where there just isn't enough drinking water, right, to go around, and you can't get safe drinking water by any means other than taking some of it from someone who you can see has more than enough, and then you go and you take some water from them and drink it to survive, we might think that's not wrong. We might think that this kind of principle doesn't apply in all situations or in all cases. And you might think the same thing about all sorts of other moral laws or moral claims. Here's another one. You must keep your promises. And if you're a moral objectivist, then maybe you think that this is one of the objective laws. But we're going to be able to think of scenarios or situations where this doesn't apply, where actually it's not the case that you must keep your promise. So say that someone comes to you and they say, I have something that I want to tell you, but you have to promise me you won't tell anyone. And you say, okay. And by the way, you should never say okay, because whether or not you should promise not to tell anyone depends on what it is they're going to say. So if they haven't even said the thing yet, you probably shouldn't make that promise. But anyway, you make the promise, right? That's a promise you can make. And then they say something that you weren't expecting them to say, like, I'm planning some terrible mass murder. Well, in that case, it seems like it's not true that you must keep your promise not to tell anyone what they said. You should probably notify the authorities. So this one too. And if you go through enough examples like this, and you think through how incredibly diverse the situations that moral agents live in are, if you think through the diversity of these situations, you might just come to the conclusion that, oh, we're never going to be able to put together a principle or a moral rule that's going to apply everywhere in all situations. And you might take another jump from that to the claim that there just aren't any. There aren't any objective universal moral laws. Okay, so that's the argument from the existence and pervasiveness of situational differences to the non-reality of objective universal moral laws. The question is whether or not this argument works, whether or not it's any good. We might think that it's true that this can't be an objective universal moral principle. And it's also true that this can't be an objective universal moral principle. But we only went through 2 examples. There's only 2 attempts. You might think, well, maybe we could revise these. Maybe we could change them up, right? And then once we revise them, they will be principles that apply everywhere in every possible situation. So change this one. Stealing is wrong to something like, I don't know. Stealing is wrong unless it is necessary for survival. That's just a more detailed attempt at a universal moral law. And it seems like it's more plausible. But we might be able to come up with some situation or scenario where that's not true either. Okay, well, we could make this law just a little bit more detailed or a little more complicated, right? Once we pick the right moral laws, maybe there won't be situations where they don't apply. And then those moral laws, whatever they are, they're going to be a little more detailed or a little more specific. Those moral laws, well, they're going to apply everywhere to every person in every situation. And we could try to do the same thing here, right? You must keep your promises unless, there is grave danger that will come to many people if you do keep your promise. We just fill out what the moral rule is in some slightly more detailed way, and maybe we won't be able to escape them just by pointing to situational differences. Maybe we'll be able to produce some moral laws that plausibly apply to everyone everywhere. Anyway, that's the thought.